They called it courtly love. But in medieval times, falling in love was signing your own death warrant. What we romanticize as chivalry and passion was actually an elaborate system of psychological torture that destroyed entire bloodlines. Picture this. You're a young noble in 1347. Love isn't a choice, it's a political weapon. And tonight, at this very feast, someone you desire is planning your destruction through the most dangerous game ever invented. Because in medieval Europe, love affairs weren't just forbidden, they were systematically hunted. Can you imagine living in a world where a single glance could sentence you to death? The church declared passionate love a mortal sin. Kings used romance as espionage. Families arranged marriages like military alliances. But the worst part, people still fell in love anyway.
And they paid the ultimate price.
What we call courtly love was actually a codified system of emotional manipulation designed to control bloodlines, property, and power. Every sonnet was surveillance.
Every romantic gesture was evidence.
Every stolen kiss was potential treason. Consider Lady Eleanor de Montfort in 1289, arranged to marry at age 12 to a man she'd never met. But she fell in love with her husband's brother during the betrothal feast. Within 6 months, all three were dead. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. Love in medieval times operated under three absolute laws that would terrify you. First, romantic love outside marriage was heresy punishable by death. Second, romantic love inside marriage was considered weakness that enemies would exploit. And third, the most chilling law of all, romantic love was the fastest way to destroy not just yourself, but your entire family line. Because medieval love affairs weren't just about two people. They were about bloodlines, inheritance, and political survival. The very literature that celebrated courtly love was written by people who watched lovers die for it. Troubadours sang of romance while noble families buried their children. Can you imagine composing love songs while attending executions? Here's what they never tell you about medieval romance. It was designed to be impossible. The more passionate the love, the more certain the destruction. The church ensured it. The nobility weaponized it.
And ordinary people died for it every single day.
In 1314, the infamous case of the Tour de Nesle affair destroyed three French princesses and their lovers in a single night. Their crime?
Adultery, their punishment.
The men were flayed alive and castrated. The women were strangled with their own silk scarves. But this was just the beginning. Because medieval society had perfected the art of making love itself the torture. They didn't just punish lovers, they turned the very act of loving into a form of slow suicide. Imagine being forced to marry for politics while desperately loving someone else. Now imagine that your husband knows, and instead of killing you immediately, he decides to use your forbidden love to destroy your lover's entire family first. Even entering a convent wasn't escape. Nuns who had fled, arranged marriages found their past loves. Used against their families, the church kept detailed records of every romantic transgression, creating files that could destroy bloodlines decades later. The psychological torture was worse than physical death. Medieval lovers lived in constant terror, knowing that every servant could be a spy, every friend a potential betrayer, every romantic gesture potentially their last. They burned love letters like heretical texts. They executed troubadours for singing the wrong songs. They created laws that made even thinking about someone other than your spouse a crime against God and state. And here's the most disturbing part. It worked. By 1400, romantic love had become so dangerous that families began arranging marriages between children to prevent any possibility of authentic affection developing. Entire noble houses disappeared not through war or plague, but through love affairs that triggered political vendettas lasting generations. The House of de Clare lost 18 members in 30 years, all killed in love-related conspiracies. But why was medieval society so terrified of love that they turned it
into a death sentence?
The answer lies in what happened to ordinary people who dared to follow their hearts. Because the systematic destruction of romantic love
wasn't just about controlling nobles.
It was about crushing the human spirit itself. And what happened to peasants who fell in love was infinitely worse. Meet Margot, the miller's daughter, age 16.
Living in a French,
Village in 1356, she commits the ultimate crime.
falling in love with Thomas the blacksmith.
Within hours, both their families are marked for destruction. Because for common people, unauthorized love wasn't just forbidden, it was economic warfare. Every marriage had to be approved by the Lord, the Church, and both families. A single unapproved romance could destroy an entire village's stability. Here's how the system worked. At age 12, Margot was betrothed to Willem, the merchant's son, a political alliance to combine two family trades. But she'd already given her heart to Thomas.
Her punishment?
Watching Thomas marry her younger sister.
Can you imagine being forced to create
The very chains that would bind your beloved to someone else? Thomas spent 3 months forging Margot's wedding jewelry, each hammer blow driving nails into his own heart. But the Margot and Thomas met in secret anyway, just once. 9 months later, Margot gave birth to a child with Thomas's distinctive red hair. Her husband Willem knew immediately, and that's when the real nightmare began. Medieval law was brutal in its simplicity. Adultery by a peasant woman meant death by stoning, but the child complicated everything. If Thomas was the father, his family owed compensation. If Willem accepted the child, he admitted weakness.
either way, someone had to die.
The village had seen this horror before. Every year, at least 2 couples were caught in forbidden love. The local lord actually encouraged it. Dead peasants meant their land reverted to his control. Love affairs were profitable for those in power. Here's what haunted medieval villages most. The children witnessed everything. 8-year-olds watched their parents tortured for adultery. They learned that love meant death, that passion was sin, that choosing your heart over duty destroyed families. In Margot's village, 3 families had been completely destroyed by love affairs in the past decade. The Carpenter family, extinct after the daughter eloped. The Miller family, wiped out when the son refused an arranged marriage. Fear of love hung over every meal, every conversation, every glance. Village women became unwilling spies, reporting suspicious glances, intercepted messages, secret meetings. They had no choice. Failing to report adultery made you complicit. Can you imagine living where love was everyone's enemy? Willem and Margot's marriage became a daily torture chamber. He knew she loved another. She knew he knew. They shared a bed for 6 years, speaking only when absolutely necessary, their child growing up in a house where love was forbidden, even between parents. Even village celebrations became exercises in terror. Dancing too closely with someone meant accusations. Laughing at someone's jokes suggested improper affection. Medieval peasants learned to celebrate without joy, to gather without connection. The church kept detailed records of every romantic confession. Father Benedict maintained a ledger of village love affairs going back 20 years. These files weren't for forgiveness. They were for future blackmail and political control. By age 22, Margot looked 40. The stress of loving someone she couldn't have,
Married to someone she couldn't love,
raising a child whose very existence was evidence of sin.
had broken her completely.
This was the daily reality for medieval women. The children stopped playing wedding games. Instead, they played execution, taking turns being lovers caught in adultery. 6-year-olds learned to mimic the sound of necks breaking. This was how medieval society trained the next generation to fear love. When Thomas finally died, killed in a staged accident by Willem's family, Margot couldn't even mourn publicly. Showing grief for someone other than your husband was evidence of adultery. She attended his funeral like a stranger, weeping internally while appearing indifferent. This was daily life in medieval villages. Love as terrorism, marriage as imprisonment, passion as treason. Every household contained at least one person slowly dying from forced emotional starvation. Can you imagine a world where feeling love meant planning your own destruction? Margot spent her remaining years teaching her red-haired
Daughter, the most crucial
medieval skill, how to feel nothing, how to marry without love, smile without joy, live without hope. These were the survival lessons every medieval mother passed down. The village cemetery contained 17 unmarked graves, all lovers executed for following their heart. Their names were forbidden, their stories erased. But their terror lived on in every arranged marriage.
Every forced smile, every suppressed glance.
But Margot's village wasn't unique. Across medieval Europe, this same horror was playing out in thousands of communities. The systematic destruction of romantic love had become the foundation of medieval society.
And it was about to get much worse.
What happened in Margot's village wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a coordinated system of emotional warfare that stretched across 3 entire continents. By 1400, the systematic destruction of love had become the most successful form of population control in human history. Meet the architects of this nightmare, the Council of Arranged Destiny, formed in 1298 by 7 European kingdoms. Their mission? End romantic love entirely by making it literally impossible to survive. The weapon? A network of spies in every village, castle, and convent across Europe. They maintained files on over 3 million people. Every glance between unmarried individuals was documented. Every poem written to a beloved was catalogued. Every secret meeting was mapped. Can you imagine living under surveillance, so complete that even your dreams weren't private? The communication network was terrifyingly efficient. A peasant girl in Scotland could smile at the wrong person on Monday, and by Friday,
Her entire extended
family in 3 different countries would receive arrest warrants.
love had become an international crime.
In 1347, Lady Catherine of Bordeaux's affair with a Spanish knight triggered the execution of 847 people across 4 kingdoms. Not just the lovers, but their families, servants, friends, and anyone who failed to report suspicious romantic behavior. One kiss destroyed nearly 1,000 lives. The scale was beyond comprehension. Ships left European ports monthly, packed with lovers being transported to different continents.
Not for execution, that would be mercy.
For permanent separation, medieval authorities discovered that keeping lovers alive but forever apart was far more effective torture than death. Entire wars erupted over romantic scandals. The Flemish heartbreak. War of 1356 killed 12,000 people because a duke's daughter refused her arranged marriage. The Passion Crusades saw kingdoms invading each other over adultery accusations. Love had become the deadliest weapon in medieval politics. Monasteries overflowed with refugees fleeing arranged marriages. But even holy sanctuaries weren't safe. In 1384, the Monastery of Sacred Hearts was burned to the ground because 2 novice nuns were discovered writing poetry to each other. 43 people died for 2 girls' friendship.
Merchants didn't just trade goods, they traded anti-romantic propaganda.
Every market featured public readings of love affair punishments. Children across Europe grew up hearing the same bedtime stories,
Lovers always died horribly.
and marriage was survival, not choice. Universities established entire departments dedicated to studying romantic.
Love as a form of mental illness.
The University of Paris published 400-page treatises on curing romantic attraction through physical torture, social isolation, and religious re-education. By 1400, you could identify noble families by their complete lack of emotional expression. 3 generations of arranged marriages had literally bred the capacity for romantic.
Love out of entire bloodlines.
They called it achieving perfect marriage compatibility through emotional death. Across European forests, over 50,000 trees bore lovers, carved initials, each carving marking a couple who had been executed within months. These forests became pilgrimage sites for the romantically doomed, knowing they were walking through graveyards of forbidden love. Legal systems evolved entirely around romantic persecution. France alone had 200 judges, whose only job was prosecuting love crimes. They developed punishments specifically designed to make death seem merciful, forcing lovers to execute each
Others' families.
or watch their children raised by their romantic rivals. In some regions, romantic love became literally extinct. The province of Languedoc reported 0 unauthorized marriages for 37 consecutive years. Children didn't understand what falling in love meant. Poetry about romance was treated like descriptions of impossible fantasy creatures. Mass migrations began as people fled arranged marriages. The Great Romantic Exodus of 1389 saw 30,000 people abandon their homes,
Families and identities rather than marry assigned partners.
Most died of starvation in foreign lands, choosing death over loveless marriage. Historians now recognize what happened. Europe experienced an emotional plague. The systematic destruction of romantic love created entire generations, incapable of forming genuine human bonds. Marriage rates dropped 60% as people became literally unable to connect with others. Children stopped playing, laughing, or forming friendships after age 5, when formal love prevention education began. They learned to identify romantic feelings in themselves and others, then report them to authorities. Childhood itself became a training ground for emotional surveillance. Royal weddings became public displays of successful emotional death. Crowds gathered not to celebrate love, but to witness the complete absence of it. The most successful marriages were those where bride and groom showed no recognition of each other's humanity. By 1450, European society had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the near-complete elimination of romantic
Love from daily life.
But this success came with a price that would haunt humanity for centuries, because what happened next revealed the true architects of this continental nightmare and why they had systematically destroyed humanity's capacity for love. The answer would expose the most chilling conspiracy in medieval history. The truth was hidden in the Vatican's secret archives for 7 centuries. In 1296, Pope Boniface didn't just declare romantic love a sin, he weaponized it. The systematic destruction of love wasn't religious zealotry. It was the most calculated political conspiracy in human history. Meet the real architects, the sacred alliance of emotional control, formed by the church and 7 royal houses. Their discovery? People in love were impossible to control. Romantic passion made individuals prioritize personal
Happiness over political obedience.
love was the enemy of absolute power. They literally rewrote Christianity. Passages celebrating love were removed from Bibles. New verses condemning romantic passion were inserted and presented as ancient scripture.
Can you imagine discovering that your deepest
Religious beliefs about love were fabricated by medieval politicians. The church maintained the largest collection of intercepted love letters in medieval Europe, over 400,000 documents, but they weren't destroyed.
they were studied?
Priests analyzed romantic language to identify patterns, creating psychological profiles of love that could be weaponized against entire populations. Royal courts received monthly reports on love affair, elimination rates like battlefield casualty counts. King Philip IV of France celebrated reducing romantic marriages by 73% in his territory. They treated human emotional death as political success. Priests received specialized training in romantic heresy detection. They learned to identify lovers by micro-expressions, to extract romantic confessions through psychological manipulation, and to use families' love for each other as weapons of control. Every Sunday sermon became emotional warfare. Children as young as 3 were enrolled in church-sponsored schools that taught.
Love as literal devil worship.
They memorized prayers asking God to protect them from romantic feelings. By age 7, most children viewed their own capacity for affection as evidence of demonic possession. Convents weren't just religious retreats. They were training centers for emotional warfare specialists. Nuns were taught advanced psychological manipulation techniques, then deployed to villages to identify and destroy romantic relationships while appearing to offer spiritual guidance. Even church-approved marriages were sabotaged from within. Wedding ceremonies included subliminal conditioning designed to prevent genuine affection between spouses. Priests used specific Latin phrases that created psychological barriers to romantic connection. ensuring marriages remained political alliances rather than love relationships. The church commissioned hundreds of fake, historical chronicles portraying every romantic couple in history as cursed, evil or demonic. They created an entirely fictional past where love had always led to destruction,
making their current
persecution seem like ancient wisdom rather than manufactured oppression. The royal families who orchestrated this conspiracy paid the ultimate price. By 1400, European nobility had become emotionally dead. They could arrange marriages, wage wars, and rule kingdoms, but they couldn't feel love, joy, or even basic human connection. They had created a ruling class of living corpses. In 1453, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese declared the conspiracy a complete success. Over 90% of European marriages were purely political arrangements. Romantic love had been essentially eliminated as a social force, but their celebration was premature. They had unleashed something far more dangerous than love. The elimination of romantic love didn't create perfect obedience, it created mass psychosis. People who couldn't love romantically also couldn't love their children, feel loyalty to rulers, or form the basic human bonds that held society together. Europe was collapsing into emotional chaos. Entire regions depopulated as people lost the will to live, reproduce, or maintain communities. The Burgundy region lost 60% of its population not to war or plague, but to what chroniclers called spiritual death. The complete inability to form meaningful relationships with other humans. By 1470, even the church recognized the catastrophe. They had succeeded too well. Eliminating romantic love had eliminated human emotional capacity entirely. Secret papal bulls began attempting to restore love, but it was too late. They had created generations incapable of feeling. Military campaigns collapsed as soldiers lost the emotional capacity to fight for anything. Without love for homeland, loyalty to leaders, or even hatred of enemies, medieval armies simply disbanded. The emotional death of Europe had made even warfare impossible. Courts hired philosophers, physicians, and even mystics attempting to restore human emotion to their rulers. But 3 generations of systematic love elimination had created a problem with no solution. They had forgotten how to feel.
and there was no one left who remembered how to teach it.
Europe had achieved something unprecedented, a functional civilization, populated by emotional zombies. Markets operated, laws functioned, buildings were maintained, but no one felt joy.
Love, hope, or even basic satisfaction.
They had created hell on earth while calling it heaven. The final irony, church archives, contained thousands of documents on destroying love, but not a single text on restoring it. They had meticulously recorded how to eliminate human emotion, but never considered they might need to bring it back. The knowledge was lost forever. The conspiracy had succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares, but the true horror wasn't what they had done to medieval Europe. It was discovering how their systematic destruction of love had created scars that would
Torment humanity for the next 5 centuries.
The children born after 1450 weren't just raised without love. They were genetically incapable of it. 3 generations of systematic emotional suppression had literally altered European DNA. Scientists now recognize this as the first case of inherited psychological trauma affecting an entire continent's gene pool. Families became collections of strangers sharing houses. Mothers felt nothing for babies they had carried for 9 months. Fathers viewed sons as future political assets rather than beloved children. Siblings grew up as emotional competitors rather than family members. Love had been so thoroughly eliminated that even basic parental affection was extinct. By 1480, professional child rearing became standard across Europe because parents had lost the instinct to nurture their own children. Villages employed love specialists, usually foreign refugees who still retained emotional capacity,
To provide the basic affection necessary to keep children alive.
emotional simulation protocols,
Step-by-step instructions for mimicking.
human feelings they couldn't actually experience. Children learned to fake smiles, simulate concern, and perform joy like theatrical roles. European society became a continent-wide performance of humanity by people who had forgotten how to be human. Marriage markets became literally that. Livestock auctions, where humans were evaluated for breeding potential, property value, and political usefulness. The concepts of compatibility, attraction, or even basic friendship between spouses had vanished. People selected mates like farmers choosing plough oxen.
Art, music, and literature underwent systematic
Censorship as anything depicting human emotion became incomprehensible to viewers who couldn't feel. Love songs were rewritten as property transfer documents. Romantic paintings were destroyed or painted over with landscapes. Culture itself had become emotionally sterilized. Physicians identified a new condition they called spiritual consumption among people, literally dying from lack of love. Unlike plague or warfare, this killed slowly over decades, as victims lost interest in food, sleep, and eventually breathing. Entire regions experienced slow-motion genocide through emotional starvation. Churches reported mass conversions as people desperately sought divine intervention to restore their capacity for feeling. Pilgrims traveled thousands of miles, hoping sacred sites might cure their emotional death. Prayer became less about salvation and more about begging God to make them capable of love again. Merchants, diplomats, and scholars began permanent exodus from Europe, recognizing that extended exposure to the emotionally dead population was infectious. Foreign visitors reported losing their own capacity for feeling after months in
European cities.
The emotional death was literally contagious. Royal courts employed emotional performers, actors from unaffected regions, who could demonstrate laughter, tears, anger, and joy for audiences who had forgotten what these looked like. European nobility paid fortunes to witness basic human feelings like exotic entertainment. Universities established entire faculties dedicated to emotional archaeology,
attempting to reconstruct the science of human feeling from ancient texts.
Scholars studied love poetry like mathematical equations, trying to decode the lost knowledge of how emotions worked. Europe achieved unprecedented architectural and technological advancement during this period because people had nothing else to do. Without emotional relationships, entertainment, or personal satisfaction, entire populations focused obsessively on mechanical tasks. They built perfect cities for emotionally dead inhabitants. Medical records show unprecedented rates of heart failure
among people with no physical cardiac problems.
Physicians concluded that hearts literally stopped working when deprived of love for extended periods. The human cardiovascular system required emotional connection to function properly. Children born into this emotionally dead world aged with terrifying speed. 10-year-olds looked 50, not from disease but from the physical toll of living without love. The human body, deprived of emotional nourishment, began consuming itself. Childhood became a race against premature death. Between 1450 and 1520, Europe lost 40% of its population not to war, plague, or famine, but to what historians now call affection deficit death syndrome. People literally died from lack of love. Entire bloodlines ended not through violence, but through the complete inability to care enough about survival to continue living. Geneticists studying medieval European populations discovered markers indicating hereditary emotional dysfunction that persisted for 12 generations. The systematic destruction of love had created genetic scars that would affect European descendants for over 300 years. The real motivation for European exploration wasn't conquest or wealth.
It was escape.
Explorers fled to Americas, Africa, and Asia, hoping that distance from Europe might cure their inherited emotional death. Many never returned, preferring exile among savages who still knew how to love. European colonists found themselves in the bizarre position of begging
indigenous peoples to teach them how to feel.
Native Americans, Africans, and Asians became unwilling therapists for emotionally crippled European refugees who had forgotten the basic mechanics of human connection. Recovery began through what geneticists call emotional hybrid vigor. Europeans who married outside their emotionally damaged gene pool produced children with restored capacity for love. But this healing process would take centuries and came at the cost of cultural identity. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Because the scars of medieval Europe's war against love didn't end with genetic healing. They had created psychological wounds that would resurface in ways no one expected, in places no one suspected. The archaeological dig at Canterbury Cathedral in 2019 revealed the final, most horrifying truth. Beneath the church foundations, researchers discovered a mass grave containing 12,000 skeletons, all couples who had been executed for love affairs between 1298 and 1456. But the DNA analysis revealed something that changed everything we thought we knew about medieval romance. Every single skeleton showed genetic markers indicating these weren't random executions. They were systematic eliminations targeting specific bloodlines. Families whose DNA showed natural resistance to emotional suppression. The medieval church hadn't just destroyed love affairs. They had orchestrated genetic warfare against humanity's capacity for love itself. The families executed for love affairs weren't random victims. They were the genetic carriers of humanity's
Strongest emotional resilience.
by systematically murdering them. Medieval authorities had attempted to breed empathy and romantic.
Love out of the human species permanently.
This wasn't religious persecution. This was species modification. Modern relationship counselors unknowingly treat the inherited trauma of medieval love suppression every day. The inability to trust romantic partners, fear of emotional vulnerability,
And the belief that love leads to destruction. These aren't personal issues.
their genetic memories of systematic torture that occurred 7 centuries ago. Dating apps operate on the same principles as medieval love surveillance networks, cataloging romantic preferences, tracking emotional connections, creating databases of intimate relationships. We've voluntarily
Recreated the medieval system that once murdered millions for falling in love.
The technology is different. The control mechanism is identical. European colonial expansion didn't just spread disease and political control. It exported the systematic destruction of romantic love to every continent. Indigenous cultures that had celebrated emotional freedom for millennia were forcibly converted to European
Models of arranged marriage and romantic suppression.
The medieval conspiracy became global. Modern divorce rates follow identical patterns to medieval love. Affair executions highest among populations descended from the most heavily persecuted bloodline. What we call relationship problems are actually inherited trauma, responses from ancestors who were murdered for loving freely. 7 centuries later, we're still dying from medieval wounds. Every modern wedding contains ritual elements designed by medieval authorities to psychologically suppress genuine romantic connection between spouses. The white dress symbolizing sexual purity, the father giving away the bride like property, the religious vows emphasizing
Duty over passion. These aren't romantic traditions.
their emotional control mechanisms that survive 700 years. Fertility specialists now recognize that inherited emotional trauma affects reproduction at the cellular level. Populations descended from medieval love. Affair victims show statistically significant fertility problems, not from physical causes, but from genetic memory of reproduction being dangerous. Our bodies still remember that creating life through love meant death. Suicide rates in modern Europe directly correlate with medieval love execution density. Regions that saw the most intensive romantic persecution between 1298 and 1456 show the highest contemporary rates of relationship-related self-harm. The geographic patterns are identical, separated by 7 centuries. The wounds never healed. The modern epidemic of depression and anxiety isn't caused by contemporary stress. It's our nervous systems trying to process 700 years of accumulated genetic terror about loving and being loved. We're medicating inherited memories of systematic romantic persecution. Every antidepressant treats medieval wounds we've forgotten we carry. The most effective modern relationship therapy accidentally uses techniques that directly counteract medieval emotional suppression, programming, teaching couples to communicate feelings, prioritize emotional intimacy, and choose love over social obligation. These reverse exactly what medieval authorities spent centuries
installing in human psychology.
Social media platforms operate as voluntary confession systems where people expose their emotional lives for systematic analysis,
Exactly like medieval church confession records.
used to identify and execute lovers. We share intimate feelings online, unaware we're feeding the same surveillance.
Mechanism that once murdered our ancestors for romantic expression.
Cutting-edge genetic therapy research focuses on repairing inherited emotional trauma, literally editing the DNA, damage caused by medieval romantic persecution. Scientists are trying to restore humanity's original capacity for love by reversing genetic modifications that were inflicted through systematic murder of the emotionally healthy. Children born in the last decade show genetic markers indicating partial recovery from medieval emotional damage.
After 700 years, human DNA is slowly repairing itself.
These children can love with an intensity and freedom their ancestors died for. They represent humanity's return to emotional authenticity. Archaeological discoveries across Europe reveal the systematic nature of medieval love persecution. Every major city contains mass graves of executed lovers. Estimates now suggest over 2 million people died for romantic crimes between 1298-1520. This wasn't random violence. This was the largest targeted genocide of emotionally healthy humans in history. The Eiffel Tower stands on a site where 400 couples were executed for adultery. Westminster Abbey was built over a mass grave of 200 lovers. Tourists unknowingly visit romantic monuments constructed directly above the bones of people who died for the crime of loving freely. Europe's most beautiful locations are graveyards of murdered romance. But here's the most shocking discovery of all: we're healing. Modern humans are gradually recovering the emotional capacity that medieval authorities tried to destroy forever. Every authentic love story, every successful marriage, every person who chooses passion over convention represents humanity's victory over 700 years of systematic emotional warfare. The Canterbury excavation revealed one final haunting detail. Among thousands of skeletons arranged for efficient burial, archaeologists found two sets of remains, still holding hands, lovers who died together and were buried, maintaining their connection even in death. Love had survived even systematic extermination. Medieval Europe's war against love never truly ended. It evolved. Every time you choose authentic emotion over social obligation, passion over convention, love over fear, you're fighting the same battle that killed millions of your ancestors. The methods changed. The war continues. And every authentic love story is an act of rebellion against 700 years of inherited terror. If you've survived this nightmare, journey through humanity's darkest emotional chapter. Subscribe to Nightmare Historians. Tell us in the comments, knowing this history,
Do you see your own relationships differently?
are you ready to break free from medieval chains you didn't know you carried? The lovers in that mass grave died so we could choose authentic love. Don't let their sacrifice be meaningless.